God versus Nature, the conflict between religion and science in history. Chapter 5. The Rise and Fall of Science in the Islamic World. As Europe descended into its dark ages, and its intellectual activity was reduced to monks copying books that they barely understood, the rise of a new religion had momentous implications for the history of science. The Translation Movement. The religion founded by Muhammad was named Islam, which means submission to the will of God, Allah. It stresses the unity of God, as opposed to the Christian Trinity, and the Quran as the uncreated Word of God, existing in heaven in Arabic. Muhammad died in AD 632, and within 1 century Muslims had violently conquered large parts of the Middle East, North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and parts of India, and had united them into a single empire under a single religion and language. As the Islamic world expanded into the Middle East, it came into contact with the scientific achievements of the Greeks. Even before the rise of Islam, Arabic astronomers in various Middle Eastern centers had learned about Greek astronomy. When Islam came, Muslims immediately saw astronomy as a science to be used in the service of Islam. It provided techniques for determining the times of prayer, the beginning and end of Ramadan, and the Qibla, the direction towards Mecca for prayer. A massive translation movement lasting over 2 centuries was given initial support by the Abbasid dynasty's early caliphs. Of these, it was the Caliph Al-Ma'mun, reign 813 to 833, who provided the greatest support for the translations and resulting intellectual activity. Following a dream in which Aristotle appeared to him, Al-Ma'mun created an institution for translation in Baghdad in 830, which became known as the House of Wisdom. This became a great center of translations from Greek, as well as Persian and Sanskrit. Al-Ma'mun was an enthusiastic supporter of rational discussion of the newly discovered ideas, and he even hosted debates in his court between Christians and Muslims. Al-Ma'mun also supported Al-Kindi, considered the first major philosopher of Islam, who worked to synthesize the ideas of Plato with Islam. One new technology greatly helped the translation movement. When the Abbasid army defeated the Chinese in 751 near Samarkand, their Chinese prisoners of war included those who were familiar with paper making. Paper was a Chinese invention from the 2nd century AD. Soon, paper mills were being built in Baghdad. Paper was much cheaper than papyrus and parchment, so it was widely used for the new translations. The translation movement was funded by not only the caliph. Many wealthy patrons paid out large amounts of money for translations. For those who could do it, translation became a lucrative profession. The first translations were of works containing the most obvious practical value, astronomy and medicine. These were followed by other scientific topics and then philosophy. The main subjects that were not translated were history, poetry, and drama. By the year 1000, virtually all of the writings of Greek mathematics, medicine, and natural philosophy had been translated into Arabic. To their credit, numerous Muslims became captivated by the Greek world. Quote, "Here, a new world appeared, one in which men had reasoned fearlessly about everything, unchecked by sacred scriptures, and had conceived a cosmos not of divine whimsy and incalculable miracle, but of majestic and omnipresent law. Now, for 3 centuries, Islam played the new game of logic, drunk with the dear delight of philosophy." Unquote. The scientific achievements of the Islamic world. The scientific achievements of the Islamic world fall into four categories: mathematics, astronomy, optics, and medicine. In each of these areas, thinkers worked first to master the new ideas, then went on to make improvements and new discoveries. The most accomplished mathematician of the Islamic world was Al-Khwarizmi, circa 780 to circa 850, a Persian who served at the court of the Caliph Al-Ma'mun in Baghdad, and who is known as the father of algebra. Greek mathematicians, such as the 3rd century Alexandrian Diophantus, had worked out solutions for certain algebra-like word problems, even using symbols for the unknown quantities. But Al-Khwarizmi took things a step further. Quote, "What Al-Khwarizmi did for the first time, and what sets him apart from all other mathematicians before him, is subtle but crucial. He abandons the practice of solving particular problems, and instead provides a general series of principles and rules for dealing with quadratic equations, solving them in a series of steps, the algorithm. Although Al-Khwarizmi uses words rather than symbols as Diophantus did, he is in fact much closer to the sort of algebra we do today than the Greek is, because for Al-Khwarizmi, the unknown quantity is a new kind of object which can be manipulated in its own right." Unquote. The word algorithm comes from the Latinized version of Al-Khwarizmi's name, and the word algebra comes from the Arabic term al-jabr, meaning restoration or completion, from the title of his book on the subject, Al-Kitab al-Muqtazar fi Hizab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, the Compendium on Calculation by Restoration and Balancing. Original work in algebra, including cubic equations, was also done by the famous Persian poet Omar Khayyam. Al-Khwarizmi also wrote Concerning Hindu Numbers, which explained the decimal place system and the figures we now call Arabic numerals, which originated in India. This decimal system was not widely used at first, but became increasingly popular in the following centuries. Other Islamic mathematicians did extensive work in geometry, building primarily on Euclid's Elements. They developed the field of trigonometry as we know it, using ideas from Ptolemy's Almagest, which employed a system of chords, and the Indian Siddhanta, which introduced the sine function. Mathematicians created new trigonometric functions, documented them in numerical tables, and applied them to plane and spherical surfaces. In medicine and anatomy, Islamic physicians built primarily on the work of Hippocrates, Dioscorides, and Galen, but they also made use of cures from India, Persia, and pre-Islamic Arabic sources. The Persian polymath Al-Razi earned a reputation as the outstanding physician of his time. Considered a master clinician, he oversaw several hospitals in Ray and Baghdad, introduced new surgical procedures and remedies, and wrote dozens of medical books. He performed what has been called the first clinical trial, testing the effects of bloodletting on patients with meningitis. Al-Razi's approach was overwhelmingly empirical, basing his conclusions only on observational data. Based on his comprehensive data collection, his studies of diseases became indispensable for other physicians. His book on smallpox and measles was eventually translated into Latin and other European languages and went through 40 editions between the 15th and 19th centuries. Al-Razi also wrote an encyclopedic 20-volume work on medicine titled Kitab al-Hawi, Comprehensive Book. Translated into Latin in 1279, this became the standard medical textbook in Europe for centuries. The full extent of Al-Razi's courage and intellectual independence is evident in his attitude toward religion. Al-Razi was born into Islam but rejected it. along with all religion. He expressed particular hatred for all prophetically revealed religions. Quote, "How can anyone think philosophically while committed to these old wives' tales, founded on contradictions, obdurate ignorance, and dogmatism?" Unquote. Next to Al-Razi, the other dominant figure in the history of Islamic medicine is the philosopher and physician Ibn Sina, Latin name Avicenna, 980 to 1037, who wrote the enormously influential Canon of Medicine. This was a detailed and systematic presentation of everything known about medicine and anatomy, and it became a classic on the subject. After its translation into Latin, it superseded Al-Razi's encyclopedia and became the standard medical textbook in Europe. In spite of explicit prohibitions on human dissection, a handful of physicians engaged in significant anatomical studies. In the 9th century, the translator Hunayn ibn Ishaq wrote a treatise on the eye, which included remarkably accurate anatomical drawings. Later physicians documented the human circulatory and nervous systems. The greatest medical discovery of the Islamic world was probably that of the pulmonary circulation, which carries blood in a loop from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart. Galen had held that the heart delivers blood to the body, including the lungs, through an ebb and flow, not a circulation. The pulmonary circulation was discovered by Ibn al-Nafis from 1213 to 1288, chief of physicians at the Al-Mansuri Hospital in Egypt. His commentary on Anatomy of the Canon of Ibn Sina contained this statement on the pulmonary circulation. Quote, "When blood in the right cavity of the heart becomes thin, it must be transferred into the left cavity, where the pneuma is generated. But there is no passage between these two cavities, for the substance of the heart separating them is impermeable. It neither contains a visible passage, as some people have thought, nor does it contain an invisible passage, which would permit the passage of blood, as Galen thought. It must therefore be that when the blood has become thin, it is passed into the arterial vein, or pulmonary artery, to the lung, in order to be dispersed inside the substance of the lung and to mix with the air. The finest parts of the blood are then strained, passing into the venous artery, or pulmonary vein, reaching the left of the two cavities of the heart, after mixing with the air and becoming fit for the generation of pneuma." Unquote. This discovery of Ibn al-Nafis did not become well known in the Islamic world, and was rediscovered early in the 20th century by a researcher looking through manuscripts in a library in Berlin. It is possible that the supposed European discoverer of the pulmonary circulation, the Italian Realdo Colombo, may have known of this discovery of al-Nafis. In the field of astronomy, Muslims based their work on Ptolemy's Almagest. Muslims made progress in astronomy in three ways. 1. Making observations to check and correct Ptolemy's parameters for the planetary models. 2. Improving Ptolemy's models so that they made more physical sense. 3. Setting up staffed observational observatories. The observations designed to check Ptolemy's parameters began during the reign of the Caliph Al-Ma'mun, who initiated a program of observation at observatories in Baghdad and Damascus in order to check and improve the parameters of Ptolemy's system. One of the more famous astronomers for this type of work was the Syrian Al-Battani, who calculated new values for solar and lunar movements and the inclination of the ecliptic, calculated improved parameters for the motions of the planets, and created a corrected star catalog. Copernicus and Kepler would later cite the work of Al-Battani in Latin translations. Some of the more significant astronomical discoveries were made centuries later to the east, associated with the Moravia school. After the Mongol invasion of the Middle East destroyed the Abbasid dynasty in the 13th century, the Persian astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi accepted a position under the leader Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, who firmly believed in the value of astrology. Al-Tusi persuaded Khan to fund the building and continued support of an observatory in Maraha, in present-day northwestern Iran. In continuous operation for at least 50 years, this observatory would inspire the building of observatories in Samarkand, Delhi, and Jaipur. In Ptolemy's system, a planet moves in a circular motion around an epicycle, with the center of the epicycle itself moving around a circle, the deferent. The center of the deferent is not at the Earth, but offset from it. Ptolemy also found the need for a further element, the equant. The equant is a point in space on the opposite side of the Earth from the deferent. From the point of view of the deferent, the center of the epicycle moves along a circle, speeding up and slowing down. The equant is the point around which the center of the epicycle moves at uniform angular velocity. Ptolemy usually discussed his system as a merely mathematical abstraction, without relating items like the epicycles, deferents, and equants to actual physical elements. But Greek thinkers such as Aristotle, and Ptolemy himself in a few places, described the celestial motions as caused by the uniform rotational movements of interlocking crystalline spheres in which the planets are embedded. It was hard to see how an abstraction like the equant could relate to any such spheres, or have any apparent physical meaning. So numerous Islamic astronomers tried to find physical mechanisms that could give equivalent mathematical motions, but which, unlike the system of Ptolemy, would make more physical sense. This led Al-Tusi to invent what became known as the Tusi couple, a mechanism of converting a combination of two uniform circular motions into a back-and-forth straight-line motion. When, in the 16th century, Copernicus created his heliocentric system, he incorporated the Tusi couple into his system. Ibn Shatir, circa 1305 to circa 1375, achieved what was considered the crowning achievement of Islamic astronomy. He produced models for the moon and planets that used double epicycles, and finally provided a physically plausible and mathematically equivalent substitute for the equants used by Ptolemy. Copernicus would later incorporate all of the mathematical elements of Ibn Shatir's system into his own. Optics, the geometrical study of vision, was another field that inspired significant research in the Islamic world, and it was especially popular among astronomers. Their primary sources on this subject were Euclid, Aristotle, and Ptolemy. The Babylonians, Egyptians, and Assyrians had used polished quartz to make simple lenses, and Greeks such as Euclid started laying down the basic principles of geometric optics. These included the idea that light travels in straight lines, the ways that light reflects from plane mirrors, and, from Ptolemy, a general understanding of refraction, the bending of light, such as when it goes from air into water. The Greeks also speculated about the nature of the process by which we see physical objects. Euclid and Ptolemy advocated the extromission theory of light. Our eyes emit light rays in straight lines emanating like a cone that illuminate the objects we see. Aristotle, by contrast, advocating an intromission theory, believed that light comes into our eyes from the objects we look at, with the image of the object entering the eye instantaneously. Others advocated a combination of the two, with light emitting from the eye, hitting the seen object, and then returning to the eye. Al-Kindi, the first major philosopher of Islam, wrote a sharp critique of the extramission theory, pointing out the absurdity of light having to go all the way from our eyes to the stars in order for us to see them. This critique was taken up and expanded upon by Ibn al-Haytham, Al-Hazan, circa 965 to 1039, whose famous Kitab al-Manzanir, Book of Optics, would become the standard text on optics for future generations. Both al-Kindi and al-Haytham claimed that light does not radiate from a luminous object as a single unit. Instead, it radiates in all directions from each point on the surface of the object, independently of light radiating from other points. Al-Haytham undertook a systematic experimental investigation of the properties of light and how it interacts with different types of objects. This includes experiments with sunlight, candlelight, and reflected, refracted, and colored light using sighting tubes, darkened chambers, and lenses. He described in detail his improved version of Ptolemy's instrument for measuring refractions, and he explained how he used it to study air-water, air-glass, and water-glass refractions for planes and curved surfaces. In general, his experiments served to confirm common-sense ideas such as that light travels in straight lines and that light rays from different directions can travel independently through the same point in space. Al-Haytham also made effective use of his mathematical expertise in his exact solutions to what became known to 17th century Europeans as Al-Hazan's problem. From any 2 points in front of a reflecting surface, which may be curved, as in spherical, cylindric, or conic, find the point or points on the surface at which the light from one point will be reflected to the other. Building on his observations, Al-Haytham developed a comprehensive theory about how we see external objects, explaining how light is emitted from each point on the visible body. When the light enters the eye, it is refracted in such a way so that the eye's vitreous humor could sense the resulting image, the form of the object seen. He stopped short of considering the eye as a camera obscura or lensed camera. Johannes Kepler would later make this discovery in the 16th century. Because of his extensive use of experiments and mathematical analysis, Al-Haytham has been referred to as the first true scientist. Al-Haytham's book on optics would later be translated into Latin and avidly studied by Europeans such as Kepler and Descartes, who considered it the chief authority on the subject of optics. 2 other experimental discoveries in optics are worth noting. Ibn Saul in Baghdad did an experimental study of the refraction of light passing from one transparent medium to another through straight and curved surfaces. By measuring the angles of incidence and refraction, he arrived at the geometrical equivalent to the modern law of refraction, known today as Snell's law. The other optical discovery involved the nature of the rainbow. Al-Farhizi of the Maraha circle was familiar with Al-Haytham's book on optics and his experiments. Inspired by Ibn Sina's theory that it is the sunlight's reflection from individual water droplets that creates the rainbow, he decided to do his own experiment. He created a glass sphere and filled it with water, then shone light rays of solar light on it. By this means, he was able to determine that both reflection and refraction were necessary to produce the rainbow. When light enters the drop, it is refracted, then it is reflected at the back of the drop, then refracted again on leaving the drop. This creates the primary rainbow. When the light was reflected twice, this produced the secondary rainbow. This was the very same experiment that was done independently by Theodoric of Freiburg in Europe around the same time. Significantly, Theodoric had also been inspired by Al-Haytham's book on optics. The preceding pages have given an overview of the scientific achievements of the Islamic Golden Age. We can see that the scientists of this era got their intellectual starting points by studying the Greeks. Based on these starting points, they made real advances. Historian Toby Huff argues that, quote, considered altogether, in mathematics, astronomy, optics, physics, and medicine, Arabic science was the most advanced in the world, unquote. But this progress did not last. After 3 centuries of intellectual productivity, the Islamic world went into a decline from which it has never recovered. In order to understand why this occurred, we must look at the relation between reason and faith in the Islamic world. Islamic faith versus reason and philosophy. In spite of the genuine scientific achievements listed in the previous section, it would be a mistake to assume that science was deeply integrated into Islamic culture. Muslims emphasized a distinction between the foreign, or intruding, or alien sciences, such as philosophy, physics, astronomy, and medicine, and the Islamic sciences, which concerned themselves with the Quran, the Hadith, the sayings attributed to Muhammad, and Islamic law. 2 aspects of the foreign sciences made them alien to Islamic culture. 1. They intruded from Greece and were not indigenous to Islamic culture. 2. More fundamentally, they employed the method of reason, not faith. While there was a long-lasting tradition of studying the foreign sciences, this tradition was always centered on a relatively small number of wealthy and powerful individuals for patronage. Science and philosophy were rarely taught in the established schools, the madrasas, which focused on the Islamic sciences. The overall Muslim attitude toward reason and science is evident in its approaches to both philosophy and theology. Consider 3 of the prominent philosophers of the Islamic world: Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Ibn Sina. Al-Kindi held that God created the universe out of nothing and that everything in the Quran is true and reconcilable with reason. Al-Farabi wrote that reason provides us with the truth because God, as creator and controller of the universe, is the source and archetype of reason. Ibn Sina, esteemed as a great scholar of Aristotle as well as of medicine, held that universals exist in the mind of God, and that God uses these as models for creating things in the world. Given the central role that Islam played in their thought, it is arguably more accurate to classify these thinkers as theologians than philosophers, theology being the use of deductive logic to infer aspects of reality from faith-based starting points. Now let us turn to the theologians. The Abbasids, the supporters of the translation movement in the House of Wisdom, also supported the first fully developed theological school in Islam, known as the Mu'tazilites. The Mu'tazilites used Greek philosophical concepts and logic to explicate Islamic teachings. They championed what they called reason, but for them, this meant the use of deductive logic starting from faith-based premises. Their reason was not an inductive reason that looks at the world and bases its conclusions on observable evidence. Saying that, quote, the mind can know things as distinct from having opinions about them, and that objective reality exists, unquote, the Mu'tazilites provided elements of a philosophical foundation that could, in some sense, help to justify natural science. Quote, the concept of an inherent nature in things means that God, though he is the first cause, acts indirectly through secondary causes, such as the physical law of gravity. In other words, God does not immediately and directly do everything. he does not make the rock fall. Gravity does. God allows some autonomy in his creation, which has its own set of rules, according to how it was made. As Mutazilite writer and theologian Uthman al-Jahiz stated, every material element has its own nature. God created each thing with a nature according to which it consistently behaves. The unsupported rock will always fall where there is gravitational pull. These laws of nature, then, are not an imposition of order from without by a commander-in-chief, but an expression of it from within the very essence of things, which have their own integrity." Unquote. This distinction between primary and secondary causes is one that we will see in the Christian world as well. This distinction offers the scientist a semi-plausible middle way between the primacy of existence, which his scientific work requires, and the primacy of consciousness, which his religious belief requires. This allows the scientist to split his soul into two halves to avoid thinking about religion while he is doing science. It withdraws God from an active role in our lives. Why is this distinction only semi-plausible? Because if God is truly all-powerful, then he can decide to violate the laws at any moment, as frequently as his whims dictate, and he can make any senselessly bizarre thing occur. As supporters of a deductive reason who were influenced by Plato and Aristotle to a lesser extent, the Mutazilites came into conflict with Islamic traditionalists such as Ibn Hanbal on numerous issues such as free will, the created nature of the Quran, and the interpretation of the literal Quran. The Quran's references to God's hands and face and God's sitting on the throne generated much debate. The Mutazilites interpreted these references as metaphors, but traditionalists held that, as part of the revealed Quran, these terms must be literally correct. One prominent traditionalist said, quote, "The sitting is known. Its modality is unknown. Belief in it is an obligation, and raising questions regarding it is a heresy." Unquote. The relatively pro-reason view of the Mutazilites came under sustained attack from a rival school of theology that emphasized the omnipotence of God's will. The founder of this school of theology was Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari. Seeking to return to a more traditionalist approach to Islam, the Ash'arite view focused on God's uncompromising omnipotence and will. Quote, "Allah does what he wills," unquote, Quran 14:27. Quote, "The Ash'arite argument reduced God to his omnipotence by concentrating exclusively on his unlimited power, as against his reason. God's reasons are unknowable by man. God rules as he pleases. Allah had only to say, 'Be,' in order to bring the world into existence, but he may also say, 'Not be,' to bring about its end, without a reason for doing either." Unquote. The Ash'arite turn back to a traditionalist Islam even led to the explicit dismissal of the value of physics. The Ash'arite Ibn Khaldun put it this way, quote, "We must refrain from studying these things, since such restraint falls under the duty of the Muslim to not do what does not concern him. The problems of physics are of no importance for us in our religious affairs or our livelihoods. Therefore, we must leave them alone." Unquote. In reviewing the main branches of Islamic philosophy and theology, it is clear that the Greek perspective of reason based on looking at the world was never popular. Almost all Islamic philosophy uses God and his omnipotence as a starting point. The Islamic theologians share this tenet, and philosopher Andrew Bernstein explains, quote, "The Mutazila held that God is reason, his creation is rationally intelligible, and consequently, reason, by which they meant deductive logic from the definition of God, is the final arbiter of theologic inquiry. Al-Ash'ari and his supporters start with the Quran and the Hadith. They hold that reason can, in some cases, explicate scriptural teachings, and they hold that the holy texts are, in all cases, to be accepted, never doubted. Ibn Hanbal and his followers embrace the holy texts literally and eschew all theology. Unquote. Bernstein concludes that, quote, philosophy, as conceived by the Greeks, observation-based rationality applied to life's most fundamental questions, never openly existed under Islam. Unquote. Al-Ghazāli as the culmination of Islam's attack on reason and science. The most important theologian of Islam was Al-Ghazāli, 1058 to 1111, who was deeply influenced by the Ash'arites. In his work, Incoherence of the Philosophers, Al-Ghazāli not only attacked the value of philosophy and science, he directly attacked the idea of cause and effect, which is fundamental to science. Quote, the connection between what is habitually believed to be a cause and what is habitually believed to be an effect is not necessary. For example, there is no causal connection between the quenching of thirst and drinking, satiety and eating, burning and contact with fire, light and the appearance of the sun, death and decapitation, healing and the drinking of medicine, the purging of the bowels and the using of a purgative, and so on, to include all that is observable among connected things in medicine, astronomy, arts, and crafts. Their connection is due to the prior decree of God, who creates them side by side. It is within divine power to create satiety without eating, to create death without decapitation, to continue life after decapitation, and so on to all connected things. Our opponent claims that the agent of the burning is the fire exclusively. This is a natural, not a voluntary agent. This we deny, saying the agent of the burning is God, through his creating the black in the cotton and the disconnection of its parts. And it is God who made the cotton burn, and made it ashes, either through the intermediation of angels or without intermediation. For fire is a dead body which has no action. And what is the proof that it is the agent? Observation proves only simultaneity, not causation. And in reality, there is no other cause but God. Unquote. So here again, we see the primacy of consciousness laid bare. Al-Ghazāli's most famous critic was the prominent physician and philosopher Ibn Rushd, or in Latin, Averroes, from 1126 to 1198. In his book, The Incoherence of the Incoherence, Ibn Rushd systematically answered Al-Ghazāli and defended the value of philosophy and deductive reason. Through his extensive commentaries on the writings of Aristotle, Ibn Rushd established himself as the greatest Aristotelian scholar of the Islamic world. Ibn Rushd worked systematically to adapt Aristotelian ideas into an Islamic framework. He agreed with Aristotle that the universe is in some sense eternal, not created ex nihilo or at one point in time, although he held that in another sense God had created the world. Like the Mutazilites, he ultimately saw God as the source of everything, and he accepted the Quran as infallible, although often requiring careful interpretation. The last of the major Islamic philosophers, Ibn Rushd was highly influential on later Christians and Jews, but within the Islamic world he was ignored. The clear victor in this battle was Al-Ghazāli, who is still revered by Muslims throughout the world. Science fades away and European discoveries are ignored. The victory of Al-Ghazāli and the fundamentalists did not bring an immediate end to Islamic science, which slowly declined in the following several centuries. But the overall effect was apparent. The forces of religious conservatism now had the upper hand, and science was in retreat. The study of the natural world had lost its respectability. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the full extent of the Islamic introversion and what Toby Huff has called a, quote, curiosity deficit, unquote, becomes apparent when we look at the Islamic reaction to two key European inventions, the telescope and the printing press. The telescope was arguably the most important invention of the scientific revolution. When Galileo turned his telescope to the sky in 1609, his discoveries triggered an avalanche of ideas and further discoveries, ultimately overthrowing the classical view of the universe. The Islamic reaction to the telescope was notably different. According to historian Toby Huff, quote, telescopes had been widely disseminated across the Ottoman Middle East, among the Safavids, and in the Mughal Empire within a decade or two of their invention in Europe in 1608-1609, and the appearance of Galileo's revolutionary revelations in The Starry Messenger of 1610. Yet, the telescope's arrival in Muslim lands, in Mughal India, the Ottoman Empire, and elsewhere, hardly created a stir. No new observatories were built, no improved telescopes were manufactured, and no cosmological debate about what the telescope revealed in the heavens have been reported. Unquote. When the telescope came into use in the Islamic world, Muslim astronomers ignored it. Quote, there is no indication that Middle Eastern scholars used the telescope for astronomical exploration, nor did they make any replicas of the Western-invented telescopes that arrived in the Muslim world. Neither do we have any indication that Muslim scholars were in search of or open to new theoretical ideas in astronomy. Indeed, the shift to a Copernican and Newtonian worldview was greatly delayed in the Middle East. Unquote. Unlike the telescope, the printing press was not a scientific instrument, but it was crucially important to the widespread dissemination of knowledge in Europe. Gutenberg printed his Bible in the 1450s, and soon after this, presses appeared in all the major cities of Europe. The following century saw an explosion of printed books on a wide variety of subjects, but the story in the Islamic world was different. Quote, with its wealth, scholastic traditions, and urban comforts, Islam, you might think, was a perfect seedbed for the printing press. The Muslims had paper, they had ink. Knowledge of printing came with Jewish refugees fleeing from persecution in Spain to Constantinople. In 1493, Jewish refugees from Spain and Constantinople produced the first books in Hebrew, Bibles and secular books. A Quran was printed in Arabic in Italy by 1500. A generation later, in 1530, the grandson of Israel Nathan Sokino, founder of the great Jewish German-Italian publishing family, set up in Istanbul and later moved to Cairo. There is no way that an educated Muslim could not have known about printing or its potential. And yet, from Muslim traders, scholars, administrators, not a flicker of interest or downright hostility. When the first printing works was established in Istanbul in 1729, the printer managed to print just 17 titles before religious opposition became so intense that the press was closed down in 1742. Unquote. The use of the printing press did not become widespread in the Islamic world until the mid-19th century, 400 years after it had become established in Europe. Why did it take so long? The main reason for Islamic opposition to printing seems to be the objective nature of the printed word. Historian Francis Robinson has argued that, quote, printing attacked the very heart of Islamic systems for the transmission of knowledge. It attacked what was understood to make knowledge trustworthy, what gave it value and authority. Unquote. What supposedly made knowledge trustworthy was its direct oral transmission from one person to another, as the Quran was transmitted. Quote, the Quran was always transmitted orally. This was how the prophet transmitted the message he had received from God to his followers. When, a few years after the prophet's death, these messages came to be written down, it was only as an aid to memory and oral transmission. This has been the function of the written Quran ever since. Printing, by multiplying texts willy-nilly, struck right at the heart of person-to-person transmission of knowledge. It struck right at the heart of Islamic authority. Unquote. In the form of a printed text, a work has a type of objectivity. As a physical object, it has a certain independence from anyone's consciousness. It can be studied without explicit regard for who created it, by focusing on verifying it against reality. But in the Islamic view, knowledge was supposed to be passed directly from one person to another, in the form of vocal recitations. If there was no direct tie between the person of the source and the reader, then the knowledge was suspect, in doubt. This was an authoritarian view of knowledge itself. This view is also a sign of a deeper philosophic orientation, the primacy of consciousness, in this case, the consciousness of the originator of the text. The primacy of consciousness orientation explains much more than just the Islamic aversion to the printing press. It explains the ultimate failure of science in the Islamic world. The achievements of Islamic science came from the importation of the primacy of existence from ancient Greece. But, unfortunately, the philosophy of Aristotle was never to penetrate deeply into the Islamic world. Even the more pro-logic Mutazilites were not real supporters of observation-based reason. The theology of the Ash'arites was an unusually consistent form of the primacy of consciousness. By stressing God's omnipotence, they stressed the primacy of God's consciousness and completely undercut the foundations of reason and science. The ultimate result is clear. In the words of the 20th century Pakistani physicist Pervez Hoodbhoy, quote, science in the Islamic world essentially collapsed. No major invention or discovery has emerged from the Muslim world for over 7 centuries now. Unquote. The victory of the primacy of consciousness was indeed complete.